I am thrilled to have on the podcast today one of my favorite people, Colleen Hroncich, who is a policy analyst with the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. There, Colleen maintains the private schooling status tracker, which tracks private school openings and permanent closures, along with tuition and demographic information. And each week, each Friday, in fact, Colleen publishes the Friday feature on the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom blog. And there she shares interesting stories in the educational space, including innovative schools and education entrepreneurs. Colleen is a longtime homeschooling mom of four children who are now either in college or who have already graduated. So we'll talk a little bit about her reflections, having graduated all of these students into the world and what that experience was like. Colleen Hroncich, welcome back to the Liberated podcast.
Thanks, Kerry. I'm so happy to be here chatting with you. It's nice to see you face to face, even if not in person.
Yes, always great to talk with you and hear some of the great work that you're doing. I thought today we would just have a wide-ranging conversation around several education-related topics, specifically school choice policies, maybe sort of a primer on that. What is that like? Then talk a little bit about your Friday feature and education entrepreneurship and innovation, what you're seeing from the conversations you're having with founders and innovators in the space. And then reflections on homeschooling in terms of what your experience was like and, sort of larger trends in the homeschooling movement, certainly over the past decade and in recent years, even more pronounced. So I'm really excited for our chat and love to just start with some of your sort of overview about school choice policies, because on this podcast, I'm often talking about the the states that have passed universal school choice policies that apply to all K to 12 students. We're talking about the now 34 states that have some form of private school choice, in addition to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. And I don't know that I ever do a good enough job of really explaining what we mean by school choice and some of the various policies. And I know you have a fabulous presentation I've heard you give that really lays it out, I think, in such a clear and concise way. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say school choice.
Right. And sometimes it's fun to think just like why do we have this thing called school choice? We don't have a movement called grocery choice. We don't have a movement called hospital choice. Why do we have something called school choice? And
Yeah.
so I think it does help to go back to the beginning sometimes. And really, from the earliest days of the country, there was a movement to have some sort of government involvement in education. Typically that was funding support, especially for families that didn't have the means. And there were various reasons for this. For a lot of people, it was religious. It was a pretty Protestant nation at the time, and they wanted to inculcate that in the population. For others, it was more about Americanism, especially as immigration picked up in America and especially Catholic immigrants. And so there was a push to make sure people like were true Americans by the definition, that the people in charge had at the time. So there were different, and for some it was self-governance too. This was a new nation, a new experiment in this sort of self-governance. And so there was certainly a strain of thought that we needed to have education in order to make sure that people were capable of that self-governance. So a lot of different impulses that were all at play. And the result of it was that eventually every state started mandating people attend, fund, and that the government provide education. So we ended up with this monopoly system that was putting kids into schools based just on where they live, not necessarily on what those kids needed or what was working for them or their religious or moral values, any of that. So it was because of all of that that we, came up with this thing called school choice. And even that, while it's not a very new movement necessarily, the term is, or well, it is a rather new movement. The term is a bit outdated already because it was originally just that. It was you could choose the government school that you were assigned to, or you could choose a private school using maybe a voucher. So even the term that we use, school choice, is a little bit outdated because it's so much more than that now. So now there has been in recent years a big upsurge in these programs. And what they do is they allow some of that funding that currently would be going to a public school, government run school. And instead, parents can use it for a private school, maybe for a different government school, maybe for a mixture of part-time school, part-time at home, or for just educating their kids at home. And that's really opened up the door for a lot of the things that we both love talking about with this education entrepreneurship. Now that the funding is following the kids in so many states, has really made that more doable in a lot of places, both for the founders of these schools and, of course, for the parents who want to send their kids to them.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about some of the different policies. And I think I misspoke earlier because it's hard to keep up. I think I said there were about a dozen states that have universal choice, but now we're up to 15 and probably more to come this year. So tell us a little bit about what are some of the choice policies, especially the newer ones that are being passed.
Right. Well, a lot of times if you read the news, you would think everything is a voucher, and it's just
Yeah.
really not. Vouchers were one of the earliest programs, and that was, kind of like a coupon, if you will, that you could use for tuition to private school. And then they started out with tax credit scholarships, and that was kind of still like a voucher, but it was funded with tax credits instead of tax dollars. So it was donations that the people got a tax credit for. But the thing that really excites me is education savings accounts. And
Mm.
that's where you first have the type of program that allows the customization, so parents can choose from a wide range of options. They could do part-time private school, they could do tutoring for kids with special needs. This has been incredibly useful for because they can do all sorts of different services that you just can't get in a typical brick and mortar school. And then, everybody's the space is always innovating. That's one of the exciting things. And so recently, refundable tax credits have been a big thing. So with the education savings account, it's dollars, the state dollars are going into an account, and parents can use those accounts kind of like you use an HSA, a health savings account, where you can use it for a bunch of different purchases. You use it at the doctor's office, you use it at the drugstore, or things like that. With the refundable tax credits, it's different because you're getting a credit on your state taxes. So if you spent $5,000 on private school tuition, then you would get a $5,000 credit on your taxes. Now, the refundable part of that is a little bit more complicated because what that does is that allows, so if a family's tax liability doesn't hit that $5,000, they would still get that as a refund. So there is some state dollars involved in it. So it's not just a credit necessarily on your own taxes, just that depends on your income. So for the higher income people who are paying higher taxes, it's just a credit, typically on their taxes. But for the lower income people who don't have the same level of tax burden, there's that refundable part of it where they're still getting the credit up to the amount that they paid in tuition or in home education expenses, things like that.
Yeah, and the tax credits are really the gold standard because the money stays with the taxpayer. It never goes to the kind of
Right.
state coffers. So, something we really should be pushing for. Oklahoma, I know, has a refundable tax credit for students who are a universal refundable tax credit for students who are in private school or homeschooling. It's a different amount. I think it's what, 5,000 for private school and 2,500 for homeschool. You've done some great work in sort of taking the homeschooler perspective on school choice policies, including a wonderful paper you published through Cato about the need for a firewall with these school choice policies that protects homeschoolers. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about kind of the homeschooling component to school choice policy.
Sure, absolutely. And as a homeschooler, and you can relate to this too, we don't want the government involved in what we're doing. That's part of the reason that we did
Right.
this. And the earlier homeschoolers, I don't think a lot of people today for the newer homeschools necessarily realize this, that it was illegal in most states for a long time. Once when they put the compulsory education laws in place in, the mid 1800s through the early 1900s, that made it illegal to homeschool in a lot of places because the law said you had to send your kid to school. So you had, as the homeschooling movement grew coming out of the 60s and 70s, you had people getting sent truancy notices and getting, fined or even arrested sometimes for truancy because their kids weren't in school. And you can still see stories sometimes of kids remembering how, like, during school hours, they had to kind of hide in their house because they didn't want people to know that they were homeschooling. So it wasn't until the late 80s that it became, I think officially in 1992 or something, where it was officially legal in every state to homeschool. So it makes sense that there are a lot of people in the homeschooling community that don't want any part of these school choice programs because they don't want those rules and regulations. They don't want to get back entwined with the government. The people that have come into it more recently don't necessarily have that same sort of fear of the government, or they don't have that history with the government involvement. And so a lot of times they are quite happy to have the funding that would have gone with their child to a public school. Why can't they have it? They're paying these taxes. Why can't some of that be used for the education they're actually getting for their kids? So there is a lot of tension sometimes within the homeschool community, if you can even call it like a homeschool community. It's obviously a
Mhm.
very diverse group. So the firewall is a way to design programs, and every state's wording is a little bit different, of course, but in a way that you can allow families to use the school choice programs to educate their kids at home, to customize their education without having them falling under the official um, designation as a homeschooler in the state statute. So that way, homeschoolers are completely separate from the school choice program. And it just seems to be a pretty simple in most states solution to something that otherwise gets really tricky when you have these battles between the homeschoolers who want to be able to participate and the ones who don't. Just call them something different. And then in most states, that works to get around that issue.
Yeah, and these homeschoolers who may be participating in a school choice program, getting an education savings account, an ESA, for example, they might self-identify as homeschoolers because that's really what they're doing, and that's where where their interests lie and their identity. But legally, they might be considered an ESA homeschooler or doing
Right.
kind of home-based education through an ESA program, that kind of thing.
Right. And
Yeah, and
really, you have
yeah.
this kind of already, if you think about a cyber school. So in my state, Pennsylvania, we have cyber charter schools. If you talk to a kid who is cyber schooled, there's a really good chance that kid's going to say they're homeschooled
Right.
because they're doing their school at home. But it's very different what they're doing, and it's a different legal category. And there's not really a fear among homeschoolers that the rules that are attached to cyber schoolers are going to be attached to homeschoolers because they're different. They might look the same in the fact that they're both at home a lot, but it's a completely different legal category. And so I don't think there's any reason to think that it can't work with school choice programs as well.
Yeah, and I know, you and I are certainly always concerned about potential regulatory creep and government overreach, certainly in the lives of homeschoolers. That's something homeschoolers always need to be vigilant about and push back against. But the trend, thankfully, over the past several years has been towards deregulation of homeschooling as a sector in the US, even as school choice policies have expanded. I think of one of the sort of best examples of this is recently in Wyoming that deregulated homeschooling to now be one of the 12 states with the least amount of homeschool regulation in the country. And then a week after they deregulated homeschooling in late February and early March, Wyoming became the 15th state to
Right.
pass a universal school choice program. So it just shows that homeschooling freedom, increased homeschooling freedom, in fact, can go hand in hand with deregulation. Oh, so deregulation of homeschooling can go hand in hand with increasing school choice programs. I wonder if you have, a reaction to that. Is that surprising to you, or does it all make sense?
I think it makes sense because if you value freedom, you're likely to value homeschool freedom and you're likely to value educational freedom. So I think it makes a lot of sense to say if you are going to trust parents to spend their education dollars at a variety of options, you're also probably going to trust them to homeschool without a lot of rules and restrictions on top of that. So,
Yeah. And if you look at some of the states that are trying to constrain homeschooling freedom, states like Illinois, that's trying to create a homeschool registry and some other
Michigan,
regulations for homeschoolers, these are states that don't have private school choice programs. They
right.
don't have that culture of parental choice or that respect for parental choice in education. that some of the states that have school choice policies do. So, I often say, I'm in Massachusetts, one of the top five most regulated states for homeschooling. Also, not the easiest state to run a private school compared to other states as well. And we have no private school
Right.
choice. So again, I think that hopefully more folks can realize that educational freedom around school choice policies and homeschooling rights can go together quite nicely.
And I do think that as homeschooling grows, I think that's one of the things, like in Michigan, when they've been looking at it, the growing popularity is making lawmakers and regulators look at it because that's what they do. I mean, lawmakers like to make laws, regulators like to regulate. So I think that people have to be increasingly vigilant just by nature of the homeschooling movement getting more attention. That's also can get negative attention too. So yeah, with or without these school choice policies, you need vigilance. And one of the perks of having a policy like this is if you have more people identifying as homeschoolers, then you have more people maybe who are going to push back on the regulations. So there can be strength in numbers, I think, in that way too.
Yes, and you had a wonderful quote just around that issue recently in a great article at the 74 about homeschooling. So I think that that's a really good point. And one of the reasons that we're seeing, I think that we're seeing homeschooling grow is the education entrepreneurship that's occurring across the country as more entrepreneurial parents and teachers create micro schools and learning pods and homeschooling collaboratives that enable more families to find homeschooling to be feasible. They're able to have these drop-off programs, either part-time or full-time, at a fraction of the cost of a traditional private school with lots of freedom and flexibility. They're able to, in many places, use these school choice programs to make the tuition much more accessible than it otherwise would be. And that is, I think, leading to this growth in the homeschooling population post-pandemic. We're up to now roughly 6% of the overall K to 12 school population being homeschooled, more than 3 million students. And you are featuring many of these founders of these innovative schools and spaces in your Friday feature blog. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your motivation for creating that blog and um, some of the sort of spotlights that you've done of these founders.
Yeah, my motivation was just to spread the word because despite all the attention all this started getting, especially after COVID and everything, I was still shocked at how many people just weren't even aware that these things existed, including teachers. You talk to a teacher, sometimes they have a master's or a PhD in education, and they have no clue what a micro school is, or no clue that something called hybrid schooling, exists, and not really much of an understanding of homeschooling either. And at the same time, a lot of times those teachers are frustrated by the rules, the regulations, the bureaucracy in their schools, and they don't realize that there is a solution out there where they can go off and create their own school. And that's what so many of the founders that both of us talked to, like that's exactly what their motivation was getting out of that bureaucracy, realizing that it wasn't helping the kids. A lot of times it's the nature of a monopoly is because people don't have choices, bureaucracy grows up around it because they want to have some sort of way to promote quality and to assure parents that this is a good school and that the school is going to work for the kids. But when you don't have choice and you don't have any sort of market competition, it's kind of impossible. And so the way they've tried to go around that is putting rules and regulations in place and imposing standardized tests, but they don't really work. All they do is add, I think, to the burden of teachers. So when they can get outside of that system and take advantage of these programs and be able to create their own schools and make an income, and that's one of the really important parts is a lot of these founders, especially when they're in a non-school, like a non-ESA or the Oklahoma tax credit, when they're in a state that doesn't have any sort of funding mechanism, they go off and they start these schools and basically can't pay themselves. So it's really, a burden that their local school district is maybe receiving 18 to $20,000 a kid, and they're there, making no income at all while they're providing for the kids that weren't provided for in that school district. So I think I veered a little bit off of your initial question. But
Yeah,
that
no,
was my
it's
motivation was just spreading the word for parents and for teachers that this whole sector exists.
Yeah, it's so important. And I feel like that work is paying off. I think more and more we're seeing these network effects of founders realizing that they can do this, that they're seeing their story reflected in some of the stories that you're featuring in the Friday feature blog or that I have on my podcast. And they're saying, I can do this too. I find that to be just so rewarding. What are some of can you think of a story more recently from your Friday feature that really stands out to you, a school or an innovator that you found was particularly interesting?
Yeah, so I'm always struck, I think, by the ones that are created especially for kids with special needs. And when I said this on Twitter to somebody once, and she reacted very hostile to me and said, "Well, I don't want my kid in a school with just kids with special needs." But that's not what it means. It doesn't mean if you start one of these micro schools that's geared towards, what they call neurodivergent children, that doesn't mean that's your whole population. It just means that you're taking that into an account in a very special way. And a lot of times it might be kids from all across the spectrum. So there was a place called Everything Under the Rainbow, and her own kids, the founder of this, her name is Lisa, and her own kids had a variety of neurodiverse aspects. And so having gone through that with her kids and having seen it firsthand, she decided to create this umbrella group where she like has a whole lot of different options, and it's all about flexibility because when a child has special needs, a lot of times they can't be sitting in a classroom all day. I mean, frankly, most young kids shouldn't be just sitting at a desk in a classroom all day, but especially when you have a kid with special needs, then those challengers are even greater. And so she created this like a hybrid homeschool, and through that, she's able to help kids and give them a place to come that really works for them. And a lot of times there's ones that are geared towards kids who are interested in STEAM, like a focus on STEAM, which I do think it's a little bit funny when some of these acronyms get so big that it's basically just school. But STEAM, it's STEM, so science, technology, engineering, math, and then the A is arts. So she was a former public school teacher, and she just didn't think that the environment was working for her own kids and in the kids in her classrooms too. And so she created Bright Mind STEAM Studio, and it's geared towards letting kids get really like hands-on and able to learn and incorporating like the arts with all the STEM type of stuff. And that way they're able to, kids who think differently about any of these topics, she's able to reach them in a variety of different ways. And that's really helping them get engaged and get into the learning. And that just like, has ripple effects all throughout their lives.
Yeah, and as you and I know, some of these micro schools or programs operate as kind of homeschool collaboratives. Others operate as state recognized private schools. Often that's um, a result of founder and family preferences, what works for them. Sometimes it's a reflection of the regulatory landscape and what makes most sense from a compliance perspective. But I think I'll hear founders say, we want to stay as a homeschool microschool because we want ultimate freedom and flexibility. My families want to be actively involved in the curriculum, in the learning experience. They want to, be able to engage in family travel or extended, family trips if they want to, and not kind of be tied to compulsory attendance laws that they might have to comply with if it was a school. So it's neat to kind of see that variety too. I wonder what you see in terms of a mix between the private schools and the kind of more homeschool micro school space.
Right. And I agree. A lot of it is based on the state laws. So
Yeah.
in Pennsylvania, these things pretty much have to be homeschooling groups because if you're not, for churches, it's pretty easy to start a private school. But if you're not a church, it's pretty difficult to create a private school. So if
Mhm.
you do the homeschool route, then you have a lot more flexibility and you can do the different days of the week and, have it you kind of design it the way you want to design it. And so I think that is the case in a lot of schools. And I'm always amazed at the people that have just like every option available for families. So within the one group of, it's one teacher, one group of kids, and they let them choose, part-time, 2 or 3 days a week, or full-time. And it gets complicated. It's really complicated for the teachers to do that, but because they're so determined to meet the needs of the families that they're serving, that they like go above and beyond, and so it's amazing. But yeah, definitely, it seems like the vast majority are doing the homeschool route, at least initially. Sometimes they want to eventually become a school, and sometimes that's because of the school choice programs,
Yeah.
because a lot of these programs have either more funding for the private school tuition versus what homeschoolers get, or maybe it's just a little bit easier to access it if you're officially a private school versus a homeschooling. You can be a tutoring program, things like that, to be able to participate in the school choice programs. But then once you're talking about becoming a school, then there's accreditation involved. And so it's just a balancing act of, do they want to go through the hoops that an accreditation agency wants them to do? And then they lose, of course, some of that flexibility and autonomy that they were seeking. So it's a balancing act. And I think that every leader is just having to navigate their own the rules and regulations, both in their state, just for existing, much less participating in the school choice program. So it's complicated. Like, my hats are off to these people.
So we've talked about school choice policies, their history and implementation. We've talked a little bit about education, entrepreneurship, and the innovators that you interview on your Friday feature blog. So I want to go on to our third and final topic for our conversation today, which is sort of reflections on homeschooling your kids to college. You mentioned Pennsylvania. That was where you homeschooled your 4 kids who are now homeschool grads, successfully in college or have already graduated from college and are on to career or graduate school. Um, I don't know if you know, but lately Kim Kent and I, who is a founder in Maryland, a homeschool mom, she and I are doing a homeschooling to college 4-part series because we both currently have seniors in homeschool high school who are going through the college admissions process and kind of talking about that experience. Well, you've already done it now 4 times over, Colleen. So I guess maybe sort of 2 questions, but let's start with maybe the sort of college admissions process and your reflections on kind of launching your kids from homeschool to college. Let's start with that and then maybe we'll broaden it.
Right. So, I mean, it worked pretty well for us. We didn't have, I will say, the first time, and I don't say this to mean that everybody has to go to college. I definitely don't believe that. But getting that first college acceptance for my oldest kid after being a homeschooler was such a relief, because I was like, okay, I didn't screw up her life forever or something like that. So that was a huge relief. And of course, college applications are complicated for anybody, but it is a little bit trickier when you're a homeschooler because your state laws are different and different colleges look differently upon it. So we definitely, I think, had some homeschool bias from some colleges where I had kids who were well above their typical acceptance at a different school, and they were waitlisted or rejected outright. And one of my kids, even, there was a school that he was accepted into, kind of the lesser version of that school, and he appealed it, and they let him in, and he had graduated with almost a 4.0 from the school. And I
Wow.
said to him, I don't remember if he ever did it, but I said to him, you should write to that dean that let you in, that gave you, like, kind of like, you appealed to him and he let you in the regular school, and you should write to that dean and just say, like, you made the right call. Because
Right.
clearly there was not a reason for him not to have gotten into the regular part of the school, but they just thought he needed, despite having very high SATs and having taken college classes throughout high school, like, so we live in a town with a college and done quite well in those, and they still thought he needed to be in kind of the remedial version of their school.
Hmm.
And I think that there is that. And I guess one lesson to learn from that is, if you get rejected from a school that you really think that your credentials, show that you should have made it into, try appealing. It worked for him, and he was very successful in that school. So I think that's part of it, is be on the lookout for that. But on the flip side, we had schools where we didn't have that at all. And there are some schools that really embrace it and think it's great that you can show this different path that you took. So, maybe your resume doesn't look the same as it does for somebody who's gone to a more conventional school, but you can really shine with that, and you can use the essays and the interviews, anything, to really showcase how you've benefited from homeschooling. And I think schools are increasingly realizing the benefit of these different types of education as they're seeing more kids come through their doors that have experienced it.
Yeah, and so many more have come through these homeschooling doors. Certainly in the last 5 years, as we see, homeschooling increase from its pre-pandemic levels. The Washington Post calling homeschooling the fastest growing form of education in the U.S. No signs of slowing anytime soon. So as you kind of think back to your experience of homeschooling your four kids, what do you think? Sort of the change, the biggest change has been, from when you started to then when you graduated your last daughter off to homeschool, off to college from homeschooling, was it last year?
Yep.
What have you noticed as sort of the biggest change?
You don't get as weird of looks.
Really?
In the
Yeah.
early days, if you said you were homeschooled, and I'm not talking, 30 years ago or anything
Right.
like that, I'm talking like 13 years ago, but people looked at you like you were crazy and, what's wrong with you? And it was very much, at least in my area, very much the very conservative Christian families who were exclusively the homeschoolers. And anymore, it just it's not just that, it's a lot of diversity, racial, religious, values, like
Yeah.
the why has changed a lot. So in the earlier days, you had kind of I think, two lines that were really the kind of the pioneers of homeschooling. You had the conservative Christians once they took prayer out of the public schools, they were looking for an outlet. And then you had kind of the, I don't know, crunchy granola progressives who
Yeah.
thought that, factory schooling wasn't good for kids. And I think nowadays those have in some ways blended. There's a lot of Christian micro schools that take what would be considered, I suppose, a progressive approach to education, where they
Yeah.
are looking at the child and, kind of an unschooling or Charlotte Mason or Waldorf or any of those approaches, but from a Christian lens. So it's kind of become this whole universe of like anything is possible, and I think it's very exciting. I will say my kids still don't necessarily admit that they were homeschooled, and they consider the biggest compliment when somebody is surprised to learn that they were. So
Okay.
whatever
All
that
right.
says about it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think your point about sort of the homeschool fusion that we see happening now is really interesting. And I love to see the
Yes.
ways in which founders are kind of picking and choosing from different educational philosophies and approaches. And at first glance, you might say, how does that go together? But then, you talk to these founders like, wow, that is amazing. What an
Yeah,
incredible space you've
it really is.
created.
Yeah.
So I guess what are your sort of predictions or expectations for the future of innovative education and some of these sort of homeschool programs? Where do you see this all going, Colleen?
Well, as we're getting into, so you've got so much growth in the last few years with so many like states adopting brand new programs or expanding existing programs. And before 2021, there wasn't a single universal program. Now, as you said, there's like 15 that are approaching universal. They're not universal at the gate, but they're getting that. It's phased into their law to get to that point. But that's just eligibility. Then, states are working on funding to make sure that every kid who's eligible would be able to get the funding for it. And there's usage. So you might have a universal voucher, and that's great, like North Carolina does, but that's only good for kids that are in private schools, whereas, there's a lot of kids that want to do these other options. And so I think that's a big part of what's happening right now is people are looking at what's worked in places and what hasn't worked and trying to figure out how to create programs or amend programs in a way to make them just more and more meet the needs. And it makes sense that that's happening. Like there's growing pains. There are, anytime you take something new, you're going to have some problems along the way. So when a state like Florida, when they went universal, they went boom to
Yeah.
universal, and they only had a few months in which to get that going. And there were some challenges with the scholarship organization had challenges getting that going. But I think since then, as they've added staff and they've added capabilities and knowledge and experience, it gets more smooth. So I think patience is important.
Mm.
Let programs work their kinks out, make the changes that you need to as that's happening, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If there's problems, that doesn't mean you have to scrap it or throw a bunch of rules and regulations on it. It probably means you need to have there be less regulations and more freedom and have a little bit more trust on the front end and, if there's problems on the back end, deal with it that way. So I think that just taking a look at what's happening all over the place, learning the lessons from that, and just pushing forward for more freedom is, I think, the ultimate solution. And that's really what's going to work best for families, work best for teachers, and therefore work best for society down the road.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that this is such an exciting time in education and education policy, and the future is bright. So it'll be fun for us to both continue to track what's happening and highlight these founders. So, Colleen, if my listeners and viewers want to follow you, connect with you, and read your Friday feature each week, what is the best way for them to do that?
So you can email me and I'll spell my name because it's a little tricky. So it's CHRONCICH at cato.org, CATO.org. You can follow me on Twitter at Colleen Hroncich. And the Friday feature has a landing page. It's just cato.org/Friday-feature. And if you have a micro school or a hybrid school that you'd like me to write about, please reach out to me because I'm always looking for new schools to profile.
Yes, I hope you'll definitely reach out to Colleen. Such a wonderful resource, and really inspiring to go back through those blog posts and see these stories and get some additional encouragement on your own founder journey. So, Colleen, thank you so much for everything that you do. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today. Always good to talk with you. And thanks for being on the Liberated podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always enjoy it.